Chapter 7. Old Narnia is in danger. The place where they had met the fawn was, of course, Dancing Lawn itself, and here Caspian and his friends remained till the night of the Great Council. To sleep under the stars, to drink nothing but well water, to live chiefly on nuts and wild fruit was a strange experience for Caspian after his bed with silken sheets in a tapestried chamber at the castle, with meals laid out on gold and silver dishes in the anteroom and attendants ready at his call. But he had never enjoyed himself more. Never had sleep been more refreshing, nor food tasted more savory, and he began already to harden, and his face wore a kinglier look. When the great night came, and his various strange subjects came stealing into the lawn, one by ones and twos and threes, or by sixes and sevens, the moon then shining almost at her full, his heart swelled as he saw their numbers and heard their greetings. All whom he had met were there. Bugly bears, the red dwarves, the black dwarves, moles, badgers, hares, and hedgehogs, and others whom he had not yet met. 5 satyrs were there, as well as red foxes and a whole contingent of talking mice, armed to the teeth and following a shrill trumpet, some owls, and an old raven of Ravenscar, last of all. And this took Caspian's breath away, were the centaurs. With the centaurs came a small but genuine giant Wimbleweather of Dead Man's Hill, carrying on his back a basketful of rather seasick dwarves who had accepted his offer of a lift and were now wishing they had walked instead. The Bugly Bears were very anxious to have the first feast and leave the council till afterward, perhaps until tomorrow. Reepicheep and his mice said that the councils and feasts could both wait, and proposed storming Miraz in his own castle that very night. Patterwig and the other squirrels said they could talk and eat at the same time, so why not have the council and the feast all at once? The moles proposed throwing the entrenchments around the lawn before they did anything else. And the fawns thought it would be better to begin with a solemn dance. The old raven, while agreeing with the bears that it would take too long to have a full council before supper, begged to be allowed to give a brief address to the whole company. But Caspian and the centaurs and the dwarfs overruled all of these suggestions and insisted on holding a real council of war at once. When all of the other creatures had been persuaded to sit down quietly in a great circle, and when, with more difficulty, they had got Patterwig to stop running to and fro and saying, "Silence, silence, everyone," for the king's speech, Caspian, feeling a little nervous, got up. "Narnians," he began, but he never got any further, for at that very moment, Camillo, the hare, said, "Hush, there's a man somewhere here, somewhere near." They were all creatures of the wild, accustomed to being hunted, and they all became still as statues. The beasts all turned their noses in the direction which Camillo had indicated. "Smells like man, and yet not quite like man," said Truffle Hunter. "It's getting steadily nearer," said Camillo. "2 badgers and you 3 dwarves, with your bows at the ready, go softly off to meet it," said Caspian. "We'll settle 'em," said the black dwarf grimly, fitting a shaft to his bowstring. "Don't shoot at it if it's alone," said Caspian. "Catch it." "Why?" asked the dwarf. "Do as you're told," said Glenstrom, the centaur. Everyone waited in silence, while the three dwarves and two badgers trotted stealthily across to the trees to the northwest side of the lawn. Then came a sharp, dwarfish cry. "Stop! Who goes there?" And a sudden spring. A moment later, a voice which Caspian knew well could be heard saying, all right, I'm unarmed. Take my wrists if you like, worthy badgers, but don't bite right through them. I want to speak to the king." "Dr. Cornelius," cried Caspian with joy, and he rushed forward to meet his old tutor. Everyone else crowded round. "Pah," said Knickerbrick, "a renegade dwarf, a half and half, or shall I pass my sword through his throat?" Actually, he said its throat. "Be quiet, Knickerbrick," said Tompkin. "The creature can't help its ancestry." Can you see them all gathered? "This is my greatest friend and the savior of my life," said Caspian, "and anyone who doesn't like his company may leave my army at once." "Dearest doctor, I am glad to see you again. How did you ever find us out?" "By a little use of simple magic, your majesty," said the doctor, who was still puffing and blowing from having walked so fast. "But there's no time to go into that now. We must all fly from this place at once. You are already betrayed, and Miraz is on the move. Before midday tomorrow, you will be surrounded." "Betrayed," said Caspian. "And by whom?" "Another renegade dwarf, no doubt," said Knickerbrick. "By your horse, Darister," said Dr. Cornelius. "The poor brute knew no better. When you were knocked off, he of course went dawdling back to his stable in the castle, and then the secret of your flight was known. I made myself scarce, having no wish to be questioned about it in Miraz's torture chamber. I had a pretty good guess from my crystal where I should find you, but all day, that was the day before yesterday, I saw Miraz tracking parties out in the woods, and yesterday I learned that his army is out. Don't you think some of your pureblood dwarves have as much woodcraft as might be expected? You left tracks all over the place. Great carelessness. At any rate, something has warned Miraz that old Narnia is not as dead as it had been hoped, and he is on the move." "Hurrah," said a very shrill and small voice from somewhere at the doctor's feet. "Let them come. All I ask is the king will put me and my people in the front." "What on earth?" said Dr. Cornelius. "Has your majesty gone grasshoppers or mosquitoes in your army?" Then, after stooping down and peering carefully through his spectacles, he broke into a laugh. "By the lion," he swore, "it's a mouse." "Senor Mouse, I desire your better acquaintance. I am honored by meeting so valiant a beast." "My friendship you shall have, learned man," piped Reepicheep, "and any dwarf or giant in the army who does not give you good language shall have my sword to reckon with." "Is there time for this foolery?" asked Knickerbrick. "What are our plans? Battle or fight?" "Battle if need be," said Trumpkin, "but we are hardly ready for it yet, and this is not a very defensible place." "I don't like the idea of running away," said Caspian. Hear him," said the Bulgy Bears. "Whatever we do, don't let's have any running, especially not before supper, and not so too soon after it either." "Then those who ran first do not always run last," said the centaur. "And why should we let the enemy choose our position instead of choosing it ourselves? Let us find a strong place." "That's wise, your majesty, that's wise," said Truffle Hunter. "But where are we to go?" asked several voices. "Your majesty," said Dr. Cornelius, "and all of your variety of creatures, I think we must fly east and down the river into the great woods. The Telemuras hate that region, and they have always been afraid of the sea and of something that may come from the sea. That is why they have let the great woods grow up. If traditions speak true, the ancient Cair Paravel was at the river mouth. All that part is friendly to us and hateful to our enemies. We must go to Aslan's How. Aslan's How, said several voices. We don't know what that is. It lies in the skirts of the great woods, and it's a huge mound which Narnians raised in very ancient times over a very magical place, where there stood, and perhaps still stands, a very magical stone. The mound is all hollowed out within it into galleries and caves, and the stone is the central cave of all. There is a room in the mound for all of our stores, and those of us who have most need of cover and most accustomed to underground life can be lodged in the caves. The rest of us can lie in the wood. At a pinch, all of us except the worthy giant could retreat into the mound itself, and there we should be beyond the reach of every danger except famine. You see the picture? It's a good thing we have a learned man among us, said Truffle Hunter, but Trumpkin muttered under his breath, soup and celery. I wish our leaders would think less about those old wives' tales and more about victuals and arms. Victuals are food. But all approved of Cornelius's proposal, and that very night, half an hour later, they were on the march. Before sunrise, they arrived at Aslan's How. It was certainly an awesome place, a round green hilltop on top of another hill, long since grown over with trees, and one little low doorway leading into it. The tunnels inside were a perfect maze until you got to know them, and they were lined with roofed and smooth stones, on the stones peering in the twilight. And on the stones peering in the twilight, Caspian saw strange characters and snaky patterns and pictures in which the form of a lion was repeated again and again. It all seemed to belong to an even older Narnia than the Narnia which his nurse had told him about. It was after they had taken up their quarters in and around the How that fortune began to turn against them. King Maya's scouts soon found their new lair, and he and his army arrived on the edge of the wood. And as so often happens, the enemy turned out stronger than they had reckoned. Caspian's heart sank as he saw his company after company arriving, and though Miraz's men may have been afraid of going into the wood, they were even more afraid of Miraz. And with him in command, they carried battle deeply into it, and sometimes almost to the How itself. Caspian and other captains, of course, made many sorties into the open countryside. Thus, there was fighting on most days and sometimes by night as well. But Caspian's party had, on the whole, the worst of it. At last, there came a night when everything had gone as badly as possible, and the rain, which had been falling heavily all day, had ceased at nightfall, only to give place to raw cold. That morning, Caspian had arranged what was the biggest battle yet, and all had hung their hopes on it. He, with most of the dwarves, was to have fallen on the king's right wing by daybreak, and then, when they were heavily engaged, giant Wilberweather and the centaurs and some of the fiercest beasts were to have broken out from another place and endeavored to cut off the king's right off from the rest of his army. But it had all failed. No one had warned Caspian, because no one in these later days of Narnia remembered that giants are not at all clever. Poor Wimbleweather, though he was brave as a lion, He was a true giant in that respect. He had broken out at the wrong time. Poor Wimpleweather. From the wrong place, and both his party and Caspians had suffered badly and done the enemy little harm. The best of the bears had been hurt, a centaur terribly wounded, and there were a few of Caspian's party who had not lost blood. He was gloomy company that huddled under the dripping tree to eat their scanty supper. The gloomiest of all was the great Wimpleweather. He knew it was all his fault. He sat in silence, shedding big tears which collected on the end of his nose and fell off with a huge splash on the whole bivouac of mice who had just been beginning to get warm and drowsy. They all jumped up, shaking the water out of their ears and wriggling their little blankets and wringing their little blankets, and asked the giant in shrill but forcible voices whether he thought they weren't wet enough without this sort of thing. And then other people woke up and told the mice they had been enrolled as scouts and not as a concert party, and asked why they couldn't keep quiet. And Wimpleweather tiptoed away to find some place where he could be miserable in peace, and stepped on somebody's tail, and they said afterwards it was a fox, bit him. And so everyone was out of temper. But in this secret and magical chamber and out the heart of the howe, King Caspian, with Cornelius and the badger and Knickerbrick and Trumpkin were in council. Thick pillars of ancient workmanship supported the roof. In the center was the stone itself, a stone table split right down the center and covered with what had once been some kind of, but ages of wind and rain and snow had almost worn the writing away in the old times when the stone table had stood on the hilltop and the mound had not yet above it been built. They were not using the table, not sitting round it, and it was too magic a thing for any common use. They sat on logs a little way away from it, and between them there was a rough wooden table on which stood a rude clay lamp, lighting up their pale faces and throwing big shadows on the walls. "If your majesty is ever to use the horn," said Trufflemaker, "I think the time has now come." Caspian had, of course, told them of his treasure several days ago. "We are certainly in great need," answered Caspian, "but it's hard to be sure we are at our greatest need. Supposing there came an even worse need and we'd already used it." "By that argument," said Knickerbrick, "your majesty will never use it until it's too late." "I agree with that," said Dr. Cornelius. "And what do you think, Trumpkin?" asked Caspian. "Oh, as for me," said the red dwarf, who had been listening with complete indifference, "your majesty knows what I think of the horn. And that bit of broken stone over there, and your great King Peter, and your lion Aslan are all eggs in the moonshine. It's all one to me whether your majesty blows the horn. All I insist on is that the army is told nothing about it. They're no good raising hopes of a magical help, which, as I think, are sure to be disappointed." "Then, in the name of Aslan, we will wind Queen Susan's horn," said Caspian. "There is one thing, sire," said Dr. Cornelius, "that should perhaps be done first. We do not know what form the help will take. It might call Aslan himself from oversea, but I think it is more likely to call Peter the High King and his mighty consorts down from the high past. But in either case, I don't think we can be sure that the help will come to this very spot." "You've never said a truer word," said Trumpkin. "I think went on the learned man, that they or he will come back to one or the other of the ancient places of Narnia. This is where we now sit, is in one of the most ancient and most deeply magical of all. And here, I think the answer is likeliest to come. But there are two others. One is a lantern waste upriver from Beaver's Dam, where the royal children first appeared in Narnia, as the records tell. The other is down the river's mouth, where their castle at Car Paravel once stood. And if Aslan himself comes, that would be the best place for meeting him too, for every story says he is the son of the great emperor over the sea, and over the sea he will pass. I should like very much to send messengers to both places, to Lantern Waste and to River Mouth, to receive them or him to it. Just as I thought, nodded Trumpkin. The first result of this foolery is not to bring help, but to lose two fighters. Who would you think of sending, Dr. Cornelius? Asked Caspian. Squirrels are best for getting through enemy country without being caught, said Truffle Hunter. All our squirrels, we haven't many, said Knickerbrick, are rather flighty. The only one I'd trust with a job like this would be Patterwig. Well, let it be Patterwig then, said King Caspian. And who for the other messenger? I know you'd go, Truffle Hunter, but you haven't the speed, nor you, Dr. Cornelius. I won't go, said Knickerbrick, with all these humans and beasts about. There must be a dwarf here to see that the dwarves are fairly treated. Thimbles and thunderstorms, cried Trumpkin in rage. Is that how you speak to the king? Send me, sire. I'll go. But I thought you didn't believe in him, Trumpkin, said Caspian. No more I do, Your Majesty, but what's that got to do with it? I might as well be on the wild goose chase as here. You are my king. I know the difference between giving advice and taking orders. You had my advice, and now it's time for orders. I will never forget this, Trumpkin, said Caspian. Send for Patterwig, one of you, and I shall blow the horn. I would wait your sunrise, Your Majesty, said Dr. Cornelius. That sometimes has an effect on operations of white magic. A few minutes later, Patterwig arrived, had his task explained to him, and he was, like so many squirrels, full of courage and dash and energy and excitement and mischief. Not for any conceit. Not to say conceit. He no sooner heard that it was heard it than he was eager to take off. It was arranged that he should run for Lantern Waste while Trumpkin made the shorter journey to the river's mouth. After a hasty meal, they both set off with fervent thanks and good wishes of the king, the badger, and Cornelius. And that's the end of chapter 7.